Welcome to this episode of Artist Tales, the podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm Heather Martin, and I'm speaking with Gareth Davies, who is a photographer. He often takes panoramic photos. We met through London Independent Photography, a London-based photography group. Welcome, Gareth.
Thanks very much for the welcome, Heather. It's very nice to be talking to you.
Great. Yes, it's lovely speaking with you as well. So tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into particularly panoramic photography.
Okay, well, I got interested in photography from quite a young age, but started taking it more seriously after university. And then in my 30s, I built my own darkroom and started doing my own film processing. And that helped a lot in understanding a lot more about how to get good results and, well, the more technical side, but also the ability to be able to have the full control over the creative process from taking the picture right through to the prints. The panoramic side of things, there's a little tail there because my main job is working in the satellite industry. So in 1995, I was sent down to Australia to work on some of the optical elements of the A8SR instrument. It's an instrument that was being built by the UK, led by the UK government as an announcement of opportunity instrument flying on the NBSAT, the European Space Agency Earth Observation Satellite. And while I was there, I did manage to take a bit of time looking around. My mother actually bought me one of those disposable panoramic cameras. So I had a bit of fun with that and thought, oh, this looks interesting. But when I was in Sydney, I bumped into a gallery run by a chap called Ken Duncan, who I don't know whether you've seen his work before, but he's a pretty famous photographer in Australia, a real specialist in panoramics. And that really piqued my interest. So when I came back, then I bought my first panoramic camera, a Russian swing lens camera. And then ever since then, I've really just carried on in that vein, really, since, 95, 96 onwards, specialising in that kind of photography.
So what draws you to panoramic?
Panoramas, I love the idea of seeing everything around in one photograph, the idea of having an all-encompassing view. Ken Duncan's views are sliced images. They're much more like a cinemascope view. So you see a vista, but you don't necessarily see everything in the environment around you. What I particularly like about 360-degree panoramas, so it's as if you're really in the landscape and you're able to turn your head and your whole body around and see everything around you and see the relationship of the elements in the environment to other elements in there as well. There was a bit of interest in this. It started up in the late 90s when it was being called virtual reality, but it wasn't really. And a lot of these companies were trying to sell systems. This was before digital had really got into stride. So people were taking photographs, scanning them, stitching them together. And there was a whole industry for estate agents or real estate, as it was heading more for the American market, of doing these virtual tours. And that created the interest in panoramas, but people were just doing a little slice. So as if you were in the room and turning your head around. Went a bit quiet, but in our pandemic era at the moment, I'm sure you've seen a lot of museums, galleries, houses, they're all offering these virtual tours, which are basically panoramic images behind them, but they're only showing you a small element of that, really. My approach is to not just show you a slice of the whole environment, but to show it to you in one particular image. Another thing that I particularly like about it is that it's not quite like the Cartier-Bresson Decisive Moment, because a lot of the cameras that I've used, and in fact one or two that I've built myself, they build the image up over a period of time, and that can be anywhere from 5 seconds or even a second in the fastest one to 5 or 6 minutes. So in that time, you're actually seeing change happening. You're recording, for example, if you're doing a nighttime panorama, you'll see the light change over those 5 or 6 minutes as the camera rotates. So there's lots of things appeal to me in terms of the panoramas there. So another type of panoramic imaging that I do is purely based around time. So this is the photofinish imaging, which you may have heard of and seen, say, even at the Olympics when they talk about the photo finish results. I think there have been a few results at this Olympics where they've had to really go off and analyse. The commentators and the judges can't actually judge it from eye or the timing. They actually go away and look at an image that's built up just to the finishing line. So this is where the camera is pointing at the finishing line through a narrow slit. And in the old days, the film would actually move past that slit at a rate that would match the movement of the image of the runners or the horse racing or the cyclists or the cars or whatever. So you would end up with an image on the film that was looking through a very narrow finishing line, and the long dimension on the film would be time. because there would be no movement, no physical movement during that. So it allowed the judges in competitions to be able to actually measure, say, a few millimeters on a film, which would then correspond to 0.1 of a second or something like that, or half a second. So in the old days, it really was a photofinish film, and it would be processed very, very rapidly. Nowadays, it's all digital, and that's where I've gone to. But I picked up ideas of photofinish images as a more artistic use from a few photographers. There was originally a chap, he was working for Time, I think it was, or Life, a chap called George Silk, and he took pictures in 1960 of the American tryouts for the Olympics, and he used an adapted camera to do photofinish images, but for an artistic view. So, for example, he would take example images of runners. There was also shot put, where you end up just by looking at the center of the body, the whole body is kind of rotating around that point of where the shot put is building up the energy to throw it. So it's not a new technique. It's something that's been around and in use commercially, really, and artistically for 60 odd years, really. But I found out about that from an American professor at Rochester Institute of Technology called Andrew David Hazy, who's incredibly generous with his knowledge and published a whole load of articles on the web, which explained a lot of this slit scan imaging, as it's called, and how to do it yourself using modified cameras. So that's how I expanded from just doing, say, a cropped film camera panorama into long parade pictures of 2 or more minutes on one image, really.
I hadn't heard of what you just spoke about, but that's kind of slit photography. But that, to me, sounds almost in some ways, the direct opposite to the panoramic pictures you're doing?
Well, it uses the same technique, because the way that a rotating panoramic camera, in the very early days of photography, they didn't have panoramic cameras. So they did what we do now. They take 3 or 4 photographs, stick them next to each other. Those days they didn't have the digital stitching, so you would really see the joins. But within a few years of the birth of photography, we're talking less than 10 years, there were already multiple designs for doing a panorama that would go to, say, 120 degrees, or not that long after, you would go up to the full 360 degree image. And the way these worked was by moving the film as the camera rotates. So the scene moves in front of the camera and paints an image onto the focal plane. And at the focal plane, the film is moved past a slit at a rate that matches the movement of the scene. So you build up the image over time. I suspect I know you're rather younger than I am, Heather, so you won't remember the old school photographs that my generation remember, where someone would get a wooden box on a big tripod with a clockwork motor, and it would take the whole class or even the whole school, and it would take about 10-15 seconds to move around and take the image of the whole class. And always there'd be some naughty pupil that would run around the back of the camera and appear at the start and finish. That's a classic demonstration of how the panoramic images, they're not just built up instantaneously, they take a period of time to build up. So the photofinish one uses the same system. It's moving film past a slit to match the rate of motion of the object you're trying to image. In this case, though, you're relying on the movement of a runner, a horse, or a car, or in other extreme cases, you could be on a platform like a boat on the camera and moving past a fixed shoreline. Or in my day job with the satellite imaging, you're doing the same. You have a thing in orbit and it's moving over the Earth's surface, and you build up an image line by line as it flies over the ground.
So what attracts you to doing this type of photography, either the kind of the photo finish photography or the panoramic?
The photo finish, I really like it because, for example, the Lord Mayor Show, the parade that has been televised for, 60, 70 years, some crazy amount of time. And you get an impression of that just by looking at video or photographs. But photo finish allows you to pair images that show a much closer view of the totality of the parade. So if you take a still image of, say, the Lord Mayor in his carriage going past, that can look great. You've got all of the people in the background all waving and cheering. With a photo finish image, you can get all of the cavalry, the pikemen and so on, and you also lose the background. All of the people you get the inverse of a normal photograph, where the moving elements are sharp and the static elements are blurred. Effectively, with a photo finish image, you're panning with the object that's moving, but it's the film that's panning rather than the whole camera. So with something like the Lord Mayor's Show, I can not just get the carriage, I can get all of his accessories, shall we say, around it. The pikemen, the band and so on in a very, very long image that would cover about, say, 1.5 minutes of you standing there and watching that part of the parade go past. So then I've moved on from that, and there was another camera I built based around a bulk film back, so a 250 exposure bulk cartridge-based system. And with that, I was able to get up to about 10 minutes worth or 15 minutes worth of the procession on 10 meters of film. So it would give you something that's actually very hard to print up, as you can imagine. But I like the effect of being able to show the procession in a very different way, but showing it as a single image and showing it really as the designers of the procession, and also not just all of the floats, say, together, but also the way the juxtapositions work between military bands and civil groups, like the livery companies, and also sometimes the unfortunate juxtapositions where you get some massively loud military band next to some disco whatever thing on there as well. So I like being able to show that in a way that I'm trying to get an image that is grounded in reality, but is something that you won't experience with your eyes there on the day, really.
Do you still do mainly film photography, or do you do a mix of digital and film photography for these two types of photography that you do?
I've changed over really to digital virtually exclusively now, because as you can imagine, the film costs, since I started, say, in 1999 when I did my first parade picture, 120 and 220 film weren't that expensive. The processing cost wasn't too much. Nowadays, using those films, it just becomes prohibitive. Also, you haven't got the instant access. You can't just go to a lab easily and drop it off and come back an hour later and you've got the film. In the old days, I'd come back from a parade or taking photographs, rotational pictures. I'd go to a lab in northwest London, which was related to a pro lab in central London. And even for E6 film, they had a motorbike courier that would come in and take the film out in the afternoon and bring it back the next day. So you'd be able to have film done really, really quickly. Now it just becomes so expensive because you're having to post the film as well. It's even one 360-degree image can end up costing you £5 per image. And it just becomes impractical at that point. So I started looking at digital. I didn't want to get into stitching, partly because of this problem of time. One of the biggest issues with stitching is if you've got things moving. So if you've got people, you can end up with people with 2 or 3 heads if they appear, or 3 arms. Also, the most annoying one is if you take a picture on a beach or a coastline, the waves don't meet up properly. So I find that very distracting. I have gone into stitching partly because of a project I was doing for the RPS, the Breathing London project.
The RPS is the
Royal Photographic Society. They were doing a project called Breathing London. The idea was to photograph any parks or anything that was a restful green space in London. And I decided to use that as a test for understanding how to do stitching, partly also as I decided to do all the parks in Brent, which turned out to be a lot more than I thought they were actually, really. It was about, I think I ended up with, well, it was weeks and weeks of work, as you can imagine, actually, really.
And for the listeners, Brent is in North London.
Yes. It's a very interesting borough because it covers a little bit out into suburbs, but also goes quite close into central London. So some of the parks are in fact concrete, but other ones are very, very green and suburban, where the council of the time stopped the developers building when Metroland, when the Underground line, the London Underground, the Metropolitan line was trying to build housing everywhere around to fill in. That was part of their income stream. The idea was to encourage people to buy season tickets to travel to the newly built housing that they'd facilitated being built on all of this wonderful green land that they were then selling the image of suburban or green space. So you have a very, very big mix there. But by the time I'd done about 150 panoramas, I was adding up the cost of this and thinking in some ways maybe it would have been quite good if they'd filled in a few more of the parks. But that's a very cynical view there, really. But that did help. But it also showed me some of the limitations. Before then, I'd already been using video for the photofinish images. So this was again building on ideas from someone else, actually, because there is the equipment out there that can do photofinish. Omega Electronics, they've been building film photofinish cameras for 80 years or so, but they moved to digital about 30 years ago. So you could buy the kit, but it was of the order of 20,000 euros, this kind of amount of money. Unfortunately, there are other cheaper ways around it. There have been a few camera manufacturers. Casio, in particular, tried to come up with a unique selling point compared to all of the other compact cameras around a good 10, 12 years ago. And they were trying to sell their cameras into golf trainers. So the way they did this was to provide high frame rates compared to normal video available in DSLRs or anything else. So they would offer frame rates anywhere up from 120 frames per second up to 1,000, but a very, very low resolution at 1,000. But it meant that you could mimic a photofinish camera by taking the discrete video frames, if you had them fast enough, taking a vertical slice to mimic the slit of a photofinish film camera and stacking them next to each other left to right, building up the same kind of approach digitally as you would with film. So I already started experimenting with that 10 years ago in 2011, and the results were not that good for printing because you'd only get 640 pixels high, but it was a very, very cheap and affordable way of doing it. Then the technology's improved. Panasonic's Lumix ones, they then started offering 120 frames per second at 720, so HD, but not full resolution HD, which offered you 1280 if you turn the camera on its side. So that was already an improvement. But then since then, I've gone into the astrophotography route, which is, this is partly one of the things I do, is try and look at alternative ways of appropriating equipment.
What is astrophotography?
So there's a fairly dedicated bunch of people out there that use DSLRs for astrophotography. But there's also an equally dedicated bunch of people that use dedicated cameras. So maybe again 10 years ago you'd have to spend 3,000 or 4,000 on some of these CCD cameras that were using specialist sensors. But then a few other companies like Zwo and Altair and Celestron, they realized that you could go and approach the manufacturers of sensors like Sony, who were producing fairly high resolution and relatively sensitive sensors for CCTV or webcams. There was also a market in adapting webcams for these as well. So they approached these suppliers, started buying the ICs, the imaging CCDs or CMOS sensors directly, and started packaging them inside a little mini camera with a USB 3 interface, or in the early days USB 2. And the camera doesn't really do anything. All of the power in processing is then in a laptop or a computer. But it gives you access to things that you, even if the same sensor is used in a camera, and for example, there are some of these used as, there are some that are 1-inch sensors that are used by, well, in, I guess, compact system cameras or whatever, but they have their own software on top of them. Whereas the Astro users, they want to have full access to everything on board the sensor. So one of the amazingly useful things you can do with these cameras, because they're CMOS sensors, they don't have a shutter in them. They have what's known as rolling shutter, which you may have seen. For example, if you take pictures of propeller blades going round, they look bendy because they're not taking the whole image in one go. They're building it up from top to bottom or bottom to top. So by the time it's read out from the top to the bottom, the propeller will have moved round. So it looks like a banana shape. But this gives you an enormous amount of flexibility. There isn't a fixed shutter there because you can read out a small area of the sensor much more rapidly. And this is how Casio did it 10 years ago. But with the Astro cameras, you can set what's known as a region of interest yourself, and you can build up much higher frame rates that way. So I can set up to read out, say, a region 1280 by 10 pixels wide or 100 pixels wide or whatever. And by storing that onto the computer via USB 3 interface, I can get up to 500, 600, 800 frames a second. So without specialist hardware now, I'm able to equal the capabilities of, say, the Swiss timing specialist companies, and beyond their capabilities that would have cost, and probably do still cost, a lot more, of say 20,000 euros. Whereas recently I've just bought another camera on special offer that was £250 that offers me 3,000 pixels at up to 500 frames a second. So I haven't managed to test it yet because there aren't many parades at the moment, but that gives you an idea of just how you can adapt and adopt different technologies, use them in different ways. That's one of the things I like to do. And also when I give talks to camera clubs, I will bring some of the specialist rotating cameras that they're always interested in asking how much they cost, which can be thousands. But you can go off and you can use a normal video camera. You can do similar things yourself, really.
So it sounds like digital's made it much more accessible, and there's different avenues you can go down to kind of get these different effects that you were doing previously on film.
Absolutely. And it's opened it up. So if people do want to give it a go, you can use your Lumix, for example. If it's got a high-speed video mode on it, you could decide to just stick it on a tripod and just video people walking past, go back home, run 2 free bits of software and you'd get an image like I'm doing. Whereas 15 or 20 years ago, you'd need specialist kit or you'd need an old camera that you were prepared to make modifications to. So it's actually made it a lot more accessible. It's probably the access to the information that's become a bit harder, really. Even though there are websites up about it, it's not something people are going to trip over unless somebody like me is talking with you or going around to camera clubs, really, or exhibiting somewhere.
So it's quite a niche area in photography.
It's sufficiently niche that there was a book written, again, it must be 6 or 7 years ago, which has come out of someone's PhD thesis. And in there he comments that a lot of these artists, they think they're inventing something new every time they rediscover techniques that were around 50 or 100 years ago. Partly it's probably they're trying to give themselves a selling point, but it also is because a lot of people are going off and doing things independently. For example, with the astronomy cameras, I know that there are some people using them for high-speed imaging, but I don't know anybody's using them in the same way I'm doing. So it could well be that there's someone in Australia or America doing it, but I don't know of them. Otherwise, I suspect it's unique in the UK, though, actually.
And what kind of challenges have you faced over the years? I mean, certainly you've mentioned this shift between film and digital, and so the increasing cost of film has made you explore the more digital avenues creating your artwork. What other kind of challenges have you faced?
Well, you also get very interesting responses with the hardware, because in the early days when I was using self-built cameras, fortunately that there was a book available in the late 90s. The guy put together a self-published book of a list of designs of how to saw up old cameras and turn them into your own rotating cameras, which was brilliant. It's not available on the internet now, unfortunately, but it does mean that if you go to something like the Lord Mayor's Show or the Tour of Britain cycle race or the Troop in the Colour, which I would never go to on the day itself. People who aren't familiar with that, it's the Queen's official birthday in London. And fortunately, I have 2 rehearsals, one the week before and one 2 weeks before, to make sure all of the pageantry works okay and none of the guardsmen faint in the heat. And they're all lined up the right distance apart and so on. So imagine doing that on a royal. When there's royalty around, you would get stopped by the police, really. So I've had a couple of incidents then. Over the years, you get, first of all, if you're taking a rotating image, people will always, if there are people around, if you're doing it in a public area, they will stand behind the camera thinking they're not going to be in it. And if it's going around quite fast, then you get a very surprised look sometimes. You get jaws sagging pictures. If it's going around slowly and you're trying to gently nudge them round, they can get a bit surprised by that. At a parade or whatever, sometimes you will get queries. I've been stopped by the police when I was using a Lego camera, which is fairly understandable, really, actually. A box with wires coming out of it with a Lego motor on the back of it is the kind of thing that does look a bit suspicious, really. But once they realised what it was, they were thinking, okay, he's harmless. And imagine the paperwork if we take him back to the police station, really. So that's a good 15 years ago now. But even 2 years ago when I was taking pictures with the astronomy camera and I had the laptop, that was at the first rehearsal for Troop in the Colour. You go and speak to the police, obviously, to say what you're doing. And they were fine that week. But then the next week, there was someone who was a bit more senior who came along and insisted on having my address and doing a check to see who I was, really. In the end, you don't have any trouble because they're interested because it's something different. And if they've been up since 6 a.m, standing around, they're quite interested in having something a bit different, really, to talk about. But that's more the kind of comedy challenges. There are other ones of making sure you get out the picture yourself. There are ways to do that. One is to drop down below the tripod as the camera rotates and make sure you don't stand up in front of it again before it's finished rotating. The other one is to run away and hide behind a tree and then also not peek out from behind it before it's finished rotating. There are a lot of reject images over the years, as you can probably imagine. But more seriously, in the early days of composition, it was difficult to work out how the scenes would work. And with a panoramic camera, a full rotation camera, you don't really have a viewfinder. You just have to put your brain in gear and you just have to stand in a particular place and think this will work or it may not work. Now that's then led on to one of my characteristic approaches, which comes from the film days, where I would take more than one revolution. I would take 720 degrees, so the camera would go around twice. Because I couldn't always judge where to stop and start the image, and also it allowed me to do more than 360 degrees to help the viewer understand what's going on. If they see a tree branch twice in the image, they can perhaps sometimes work out what is in a disorientating image. So that's one of the challenges, the start and stop point. The other one is, do I want to challenge the viewer? Do I want to make it look like a more normal photograph, a Ken Duncan landscape of a letterbox image, which you can make 360-degree images look like that? Or do you want to confuse your viewer and make them really think that something's going wrong in the world? And that can be fun, but sometimes it can be a cheap approach, because if you're discomforting the viewer, they're not necessarily going to engage with it. They're just going to be looking at the shock tactics with it, really. So over the years, I've gone through lots of ways of composing the different challenges for myself, but also thinking how I challenge the viewer as well, really. I also think about it from my images can be challenging for you, for the viewer as well. So I have to think about it from that point of view too.
And how has COVID, I mean, we've been now, 18 months? I was going to say 18 years.
It does feel like that sometimes, doesn't it?
18 months, roughly 15 to 18 months in various forms of lockdown and not lockdown. And, COVID is still around. So has that impacted you? Has that offered other opportunities? So how have you engaged with COVID or not?
Gracious. It's been a tough time because I have a calendar through the year of events, which starts off on the 1st of January with the London Parade, which is a massive event in London on New Year's Day, which involves a lot of American marching bands, a lot of British bands, all sorts of very eccentric things as well, like model traction engine steamers hurtling through the streets of London, classic cars, all kinds of things like this. It's a wonderful way to start the year. So I was able to photograph that last year. Then at the end of the month, there's a very eccentric parade called the King's Army, commemoration of the execution of King Charles I, so the Civil War, the English Civil War era. They march along the Mall with pikes and a cannon or two and lay a wreath at the statue near Charing Cross. So January comes and goes. You're hearing about there's something a bit odd going on somewhere else around the world, but you don't think it's necessarily going to affect you. So then I was looking forward to the St. Patrick's Day Parade, London Marathon, a few 10K races in May, and eventually heading on into things like the Lord Mayor's Show and the London to Brighton Veteran Car Run, the Pride Parade and so on. I have my calendar laid out around a lot of these events, really. And of course, there's been nothing since January last year of those types of image. So I have then been trying to do the panoramas, but I had already done the Breathing London project in my local borough. So a lot of the areas are quite familiar to me, really. So it was quite tough, really. It then meant, okay, then you go off and you start thinking about how you can improve your practice, you can improve your processing. Also, I had an incredibly generous gift from one of my talks at one of the camera clubs. It was a virtual talk to Loughton Camera Club, and one of their members runs Red Dot Cameras, which is a Leica dealer in central London, and he had a 110-year-old Kodak Panoram camera, a consumer-grade dedicated panoramic camera made by Kodak, and he kindly just gave it to me. So that was a little project for July and August last year, seeing how I could get it working with modern films, because even though the film that it was made for is no longer made, modern 120 films fit inside it. There were a few issues with it jamming, but the outcome of that was a set of images for our London Independent Photography virtual exhibition. So that was a great distraction, really. It allowed me to look at local areas slightly differently, because I was almost transporting myself back in time, thinking, what would this have looked like when this camera was only new? So it opened up a bit more of looking around and thinking, what kind of history would there have been there? Where there's suburban area, for example, now that would have been early airfield or airfield factories. So it was that was something very, very helpful, really. Then since then, I started looking at infrared. So that's been probably also a reaction to the lockdown, just by looking at our reality around us, but in a slightly different way as well. So not just the 360, but then looking at it in a way that, again, we don't see with our eyes, really. So that's becoming a bigger focus now as well, actually, really. And that will be, the images from that little project will end up in the next online exhibition. But yeah, it's been the photograph your local area. After a while, it becomes slightly challenging, really. So you have to give yourself some kind of project, I felt, really. Otherwise, you can be a bit aimless, really. The fallback thing of go and photograph your local park or walk a mile and then walk a circle that distance from your home. We've all done that kind of thing now, really, haven't we?
And last question. So where do you see your photography going? I mean, certainly with lockdown, it's kind of forced you to explore other things, I guess, in some ways. But where do you see your photography evolving from kind of post-lockdown, if that makes sense?
Well, I had quite a few projects that were long-term ongoing ones. The parade ones, I'm obviously trying to continue building up that. Having done the Lord Mayor show right back to 1999, I would like to just carry on building up the archive there. So there is that kind of regular thing that's become an annual project of seeing how these kind of events evolve. They are extraordinary because you can see the different balance between, say, military bands, whatever, or with the London parade, the New Year's Day parade. You can see the number of marching bands coming from the US may oscillate sometimes because of different travel conditions or concerns or whatever, or if there's a particular event going on. But yeah, I want to expand into other things. So they are using the technique again, but a slightly inverted way, instead of relying on the movement of the people, relying on the movement of the camera. And I started that back in 2001, mounting one of these cameras in a car and driving down a road. And I never really took it much further. But then this came up in through London Independent Photography when talking about how to document urban change and also showing the totality of an urban street, for example. Someone else has been doing this. He did some work on this in the 70s in Leicester, Michael Westmoreland, and I got interested in this just before lockdown as well. Now with the astronomy camera, I want to go revisit that because the level of detail that you can pick up. So the idea would be to photograph, say, some of the suburban streets. Ideally, I would have done these images before lockdown as well to see how they've changed. But I'd like to see the juxtaposition of the shops, what's happened to those streets, in a way that as you walk past, as you promenade yourself, you see that. But I want to try and capture that in a single image, really. So there's a little project there. There are a few other ones that I've been thinking about, again, looking at the urban realm, for example, partly related to COVID as well. But I don't know, in your local area, do you see the benches, say on a street, near a bus stop, near a tree or whatever, that have a little plaque on them saying this is dedicated to so-and-so that lost their life in a road accident or something like that, or somebody liked this view or liked this cafe or whatever. They're not in the parks. They're sometimes in really inexplicable places. Sometimes they're where someone, if they were perhaps suffering mobility, they would realise that was a good place for somebody to stop after they'd walked half a mile up the road from a bus stop up a slope or whatever. So I started documenting some of those in these kind of improbable places, things that you just walk past and you take for granted in the urban scene, but they each tell a story. Sometimes you'll see people put flowers on them at the anniversary or whatever. And I think that's made me then look at the memorial aspect in a different way as well, really, COVID. So I want to get back into that as well. There are other areas where I do some work in video as well. So the photofinish images, by using video as the source, you can also then do a dimensional transformation, which is probably not a fair thing to try and explain in a podcast. That needs probably a more visual medium. But eventually I'd hope to be able to work back when live concerts are happening again, really, because I've got other work and other ideas there as well. I think probably if you'd asked me when we were locked down again in December, January, I would have probably said I have no ideas. But I think over the last 6 months, with heading into higher technical quality with the astro cameras, also the infrared, and some of the images I've been doing there recently as well, I think I've got my creativity back a bit, really. And I hope there'll be some serendipitous ideas that come out of just even going out and talking with people, as I'm sure you find, just the bouncing ideas around, or as we're talking today, I'm sure there'll be some ideas that spring out of our conversations and the ones that we have with our friends in London Independent Photography as well, really.
So it sounds like you have some, quite a lot of ideas and quite a lot of exciting ideas going forward.
Thank you. That's one of the things that people do say when I give camera club talks. Camera clubs, when I give a talk about the panoramic photography, they will quite often ask me back 2 or 3 years later, because I often give them a little snippet of this is something I'm working on now, and they're quite interested in seeing what I'm doing. So yes, I've kind of got that feeling back again, really. Maybe last year I didn't quite have it as much, but I do feel there's a lot of excitement in this type of imaging. Really, I've talked about the photo finish side. There are a lot of other applications even in scientific imaging, and I think it's great to be able to bring this type of photography out of the lab and out of sports, really, into something that maybe gives people a different view, really. And also nowadays, there's the opportunity out there that people can give it a go themselves, whereas 15 years ago they couldn't try it themselves, really.
Is that due to cost and accessibility to equipment?
Yeah, the whole digital era has just helped a lot. Your phone has got a panoramic mode on it, I'm sure. And the little cameras with the high-speed video, then you can do photofinish. You can do panoramas, you can do photofinish images with stuff you've already got. There are many phones nowadays, they have high-speed modes on them as well. You can buy a couple of apps that will do photofinish images directly on your phone as well. So if you think, oh, I'm on a train this day, I'd quite like to do an image of all of the houses. Or on the other hand, if you're waiting at a railway station and you're quite happy to watch a train go past first of all, you can do a photofinish image on your phone of a train. But again, people don't, what does it mean? It's a thing like scan camera or photofinish. People wouldn't know what it meant at all, really.
Well, thank you, Gareth. It's been really interesting to talk about you and your artwork and your photography and sort of your photography journey until now. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Artist Tales. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Further information about the artist I spoke with is in the episode notes. Please rate and review this podcast on the apps and spread the word. You can get in touch by emailing artisttalespodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is on social media. Check the information in the episode notes. Hope you join me next episode